that action is not de-escalation. And when we talk about the framework of our sanctity of life, and when we talk about the principles and values that we have, that action goes contrary to what we're taught.
Was this a trained Minneapolis Police Department defensive tactics technique?
It is not. There's an initial reasonableness in trying to just get him under control in the first few seconds, but once there was no longer any resistance, and clearly when Mr. Floyd was no longer responsive and even motionless, to continue to apply that level of force to a person proned out, handcuffed behind their back, that in no way, shape, or form is anything that is by policy. It's not part of our training, and it is certainly not part of our ethics or our values.
Have you ever, in all the years you've been working for the Minneapolis Police Department, been trained to kneel on the neck of someone who is handcuffed behind their back in a prone position?
No, I haven't.
Is that, if that were done, would that be considered force?
Absolutely.
What level of force might that be?
That would be the top tier, the deadly force.
Why?
Because of the fact that if your knee is on a person's neck, that can kill him. I saw no reason why the officers felt they were in danger, if that's what they felt. And that's what they would have to feel to be able to use that kind of force.
Was your leading theory then for the cause of Mr. Floyd's cardiac arrest oxygen deficiency?
That was one of the more likely possibilities. I felt that at the time, based on the information I had, it was more likely than the other possibilities.
And what the paramedics told you when they brought in Mr. Floyd, did they also then give you information when they brought Mr. Floyd in?
They did.
Did they say to you, for purposes of caring or giving treatment to Mr. Floyd, that they felt he had suffered a drug overdose?
Not in the information they gave, no.
Mr. Floyd died from a low level of oxygen. The cause of the low level of oxygen was shallow breathing. And so there are a series of forces higher up that are leading to that. And the main forces that are going to lead to the shallow breath are going to be that he's turned prone on the street, that he has the handcuffs in place combined with the street, and then that he has a knee on his neck, and then that he has a knee on his back and on his side. What you're seeing is the orientation of Officer Chauvin. His body build is quite erect here, but in particular what you're seeing is that the toe of his boot is no longer touching the ground. This means that all of his body weight is being directed down at Mr. Floyd's neck.
Fentanyl intoxication, as I described, and again, I don't treat patients, I don't see living people, but what I know from family members who describe deaths that then later turn out to be due to fentanyl, the death is slow, it's peaceful, they fall asleep, they may hear snoring or very heavy, deep breathing. There's no struggle. They just often are found just kind of slumped over. It's a very slow death. So again, totally different than what is seen in Mr. Floyd's death. Methamphetamine as a cause of death generally is, again, much more of a sudden death. It may cause a cardiac arrhythmia. It may cause a seizure, and by that I don't just mean this sort of terminal anoxic twitch, but like a full-blown seizure. And again, looking from what I know about Mr. Floyd's death, because it's so well documented, that does not fit with a methamphetamine death.
Would you tell us your opinion or opinions?
Sure. In this case, Mr. George Floyd died from a cardiopulmonary arrest. It was caused by low oxygen levels, and those low oxygen levels were induced by the prone restraint and positional asphyxiation that he was subjected to. I can state with a high degree of medical certainty that George Floyd did not die from a primary cardiac event, and he did not die from a drug overdose.
So, Dr. Ritz, then, taking into account all of the evidence that you reviewed, do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty as to whether Mr. Floyd's death was preventable?
Yes, I believe that Mr. George Floyd's death was absolutely preventable.
Do you have an opinion as to whether George Floyd would have lived if not for Mr. Chauvin's subdual and restraint of him for 9 minutes and 29 seconds on the ground?
Yes, I believe he would have lived.
When you first approached, you said you identified yourself as a firefighter.
Correct.
To whom did you identify yourself?
To Officer Tao, controlling the scene. I spoke loudly enough that I would think that the other three officers would have been able to hear me throughout the event.
How did Officer Tao respond?
He said something along the lines of, if you really are a Minneapolis firefighter, you would know better than to get involved.
In that moment, when you first arrived and observed what you could about Mr. Floyd, what did you think you needed to do?
I think I had already assessed that he had an altered level of consciousness. What I needed to know is whether or not he had a pulse anymore. In my memory, I offered to walk them through it, or told them, if he doesn't have a pulse, you need to start compressions, and that wasn't done either.
Are these things that you wanted to do?
It's what I would have done for anybody.
Were you frustrated?
Yes.
I was the most vocalist person out there pleading for Floyd's life because I felt like it was definitely in the wrong. And there was at one point in time a medic came on scene and she spoke on checking pulse, what made me even go even more harder because I heard it and then I registered in it like, oh, you do need to check his pulse. Oh, he is not moving. Like, oh, you just killed this man, you know? And so her expertise was like, look, he's fading away. You need to check his pulse. She's asking him multiple times. I'm asking him multiple times. No one checked his pulse.
Did you receive a report that he had received CPR from any of the officers who may have been on the scene on May 25th, 2020?
No.
Do you have an opinion as to whether the defendant violated MPD departmental policy 7-350 by failing to render aid to Mr. Floyd?
I agree that the defendant violated our policy in terms of rendering aid